All right, welcome in everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to dive in.
I think a lot of our listeners can probably relate to this one. I mean, who doesn't love a good paper planner, right? That feeling of pen on paper getting organized, it's kind of satisfying.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's just something about that physical act of writing things down.
But then there's that moment, you flip the page and you see it. That dreaded ink bleed through from the day before totally ruins the vibe.
Ugh, yeah, it's the worst. Makes your planner look messy, hard to read, just frustrating.
And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. We're talking ink bleeding in custom paper planners. And to help us understand this better, we've got some great info from Lion Paper, a manufacturer who really seems to get the science behind this whole thing.
Sounds like they know their stuff.
Yeah, and on this deep dive, we're going to figure out what causes ink to bleed, what solutions are out there, and ultimately help you guys make better choices for your planners.
So you can keep those pages clean and organized.
Exactly. No more ghosting to-do lists.
Definitely. Because for someone who relies on their planner, and I know a lot of people do, whether it's for work, personal goals, creative projects, whatever it is, that ink bleed isn't just a little annoyance.
No, it can really mess things up.
It can. Makes it harder to see what you wrote, and that defeats the whole purpose of having a planner in the first place. Right.
Absolutely. So let's get down to basics. What actually happens when ink bleeds through?
So basically what's going on is the ink you're using, it's seeping past the lines you've written. It goes right through those paper fibers. You see it as blurry edges around your words, or even a whole separate mark on the back of the page.
Oh, I've seen that. Like a mirror image of what you wrote.
Right. And sometimes you might hear the term ghosting for that. But the research from Lion Paper really focuses on that heavier bleed through, like where the ink actually soaks all the way through. That's what we're talking about here.
Gotcha. So it's not just about seeing a faint shadow. It's when it really messes up the other side.
Exactly. And when that happens, well, your notes become a jumbled mess. It's hard to read anything. Your planner's not so effective anymore.
Yeah, you lose that clear, organized layout you were going for. And I guess it impacts a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, it does. Actually, almost 30% of planner users say they get frustrated by ink bleed.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big chunk of people who aren't having the best planning experience.
And here's something that's kind of crazy. Think about this. The research suggests that if they keep having that bleed through, a whopping 60% of people might ditch a brand entirely. That's wild.
It is. And it shows how important paper quality really is. If people aren't happy with it, they're going to go find something else.
Makes total sense. You're investing in a planner, especially if it's a custom one, you expect it to work well. So what's causing all this frustration? What's the deal with the paper itself?
Well, there are a few things going on. One of the main culprits is paper absorbency.
Okay, how does that work?
Think of it like this. Paper's kind of like a sponge. If it's too absorbent, any liquid you put on it, it spreads out fast and soaks in deep. Same with ink. If the paper is too absorbent, the ink goes too far into those fibers and it bleeds through.
So it's like the paper sucks up the ink too quickly without any control.
Yeah, pretty much.
Makes sense.
Another thing to think about is the ink itself, like what it's made of. Some inks are just way more liquidy than others, and the runnier they are, the more they tend to spread and bleed through.
Right, like water versus honey, for example.
Exactly. Then there's paper wheat, which is usually measured in GSM. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, GSM. I know it has something to do with how thick the paper is, right?
Yep, grams per square meter. So basically, it tells you how dense the paper is. And those lighter weight papers, especially under 80 GSM, they're usually thinner, less dense. So there's not much stopping that ink from going straight through. And Lion Paper really points to this as a big reason for bleed through.
So if you're using a fancy fountain pen, probably not the best idea to go with super thin paper.
Yeah, probably not going to get those nice crisp lines you're looking for. And here's a curveball. Even the environment matters. Like if it's really humid, the ink dries slower. And if it stays wet longer, guess what? More chances for it to smear or bleed.
So humidity's not our friend in this case.
Not really, no.
Okay, so we've got absorbent paper, runny inks, thin paper, and even humid weather, all working against us. It's a conspiracy.
It kind of is, yeah. But thankfully, there are ways to fight back. And it sounds like Lion Paper has some pretty interesting solutions.
Yeah, they seem to be taking this seriously.
They are, and they're tackling it from a few different angles. They're using high-quality paper, adding special coatings, and they even let you customize options to match your favorite pens. So it's pretty comprehensive.
Let's break that down. First up, paper selection. They talk about using paper in the 90 to 120 GSM range, which is high density. So what's the big deal about that weight jump?
Well, going from under 80 GSM to that 90 to 120 range, that's a big difference. It's like adding a whole extra layer of protection. That heavier, denser paper, it's got way more fibers packed in. Think of it as a much stronger wall that the ink has to get through, much less likely to bleed. Plus, it's usually stronger and smoother overall.
So it's a win-win.
Pretty much.
They also talk about using FSC certified premium paper. Now, I know FSC is about sustainability, which is great, but what makes this type of paper better at stopping bleed through?
Right. FSC is all about responsible sourcing, which is important. But premium in this case usually means the quality of the paper pulp and how it's made is top-notch. Those premium papers often have a tighter, more uniform structure. Imagine those fibers all woven together really neatly. That helps keep the ink on the surface and stops it from going wild.
Like a tighter weave in a fabric.
Exactly. And line paper specifically says that this premium paper works well with all sorts of different inks. So that's a big plus if you like to switch things up.
Nice. Flexibility is key. And then there's something called hybrid coated papers. What are those all about?
So with those, it's all about balance. The coating acts like a barrier to stop the paper from soaking up too much ink too fast, which we know is a big problem.
Right.
But it's also made to keep that nice, smooth writing feel. Because some coated papers, they can feel kind of slippery, and some people don't like that. So the hybrid approach is trying to give you both. Stops bleed and feels good to write on.
Best of both worlds.
Exactly.
Now, they mentioned this real case example of a customer named Bale. What happened there?
Well, Bale, she had a business that used planners, and she was getting a lot of complaints about ink bleeding. But when she switched to Lion Paper's 100 GSM coated paper, those complaints dropped by a huge 85%. That's pretty impressive.
That's a huge difference.
It is, and get this, because her planners were better, she got 40% more repeat customers. So happy customers, more business.
That's proof right there that paying attention to the details, like the paper you use, can really make a difference. It's not just about looks, it's about the whole experience.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's get a little more technical. They talk about specialized coatings for ink control, and they even mention nano-coating technology. That sounds pretty high-tech.
It is. It's all about working on a super tiny scale. Basically, they apply these incredibly thin layers of material to the paper, and that creates this teeny tiny barrier that helps the ink dry faster and stops it from spreading everywhere.
So it's like an invisible shield protecting the paper.
Pretty much, yeah. Keeps that ink where it's supposed to be.
I like it. And they also mention a satin finish. What role does that play?
The satin finish is all about finding a good balance. It gives the paper just enough texture so it feels nice when you're writing, but it's not so porous that it lets the ink soak in too much and bleed through. It's all about controlling that ink absorption really carefully.
It's a balancing act.
It is.
I've got another great example here. A European customer needed a planner that could work with both gel pens and fountain pens. Apparently, their sales went up by 30% after switching to Lion Paper's coated satin finish paper. So it sounds like this technology can handle different preferences.
Oh yeah, definitely. If you love fountain pens, the paper has to be able to handle those wetter inks without them feathering or bleeding through. And if you're a gel pen fan, you need a paper that absorbs just enough to stop smudging, but not so much that it bleeds. A paper that can do both. That's a win for everyone.
A versatile champion.
Exactly.
It's clear that Lion Paper really gets that people have their favorite pens. And that's why they offer custom paper options for pretty much everything. Fountain pens, gel pens, rollerball pens, even good old ballpoint pens. Let's talk about those. What's important for fountain pen paper?
All right, so for those fountain pen enthusiasts out there, what you really need is a heavier weight paper with a super smooth surface. That way, the ink can flow nicely without pooling up and bleeding through, and it stops that feathering effect, when the ink spreads out from your lines.
Yeah, feathering is the worst.
It can be, yeah.
Okay, what about those of us who love gel pens and rollerballs?
For you guys, a coated paper often works best. Those gel and rollerball inks, they tend to be a little more liquid than ballpoint inks, and the coating helps control that flow. It stops the ink from soaking in too fast, so you don't get as much smudging or bleeding. Just enough absorption for a nice, clean line.
Sounds perfect.
Yep.
And last but not least, what about the trusty ballpoint pen? What paper works best with that?
For the ballpoint fans, a paper with a good balanced texture is usually the way to go. Smooth enough so the pen glides nicely, but with a little bit of tooth, some grip, to help control those lines and stop the pen from skipping.
Right, that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
And they've got one more example for us. An Amazon retailer started using Lion Paper's hybrid coated paper in their planners, trying to cater to everyone. and they saw a 75% drop in complaints about ink bleeding in their reviews. That's a huge improvement.
Yeah, it is. It shows how important it is to really think about the paper you're using. It makes a big difference for customers, and it can really help a brand's reputation.
Absolutely. It's all connected. Now, Lion Paper has put together a really handy table that breaks down different paper types and their properties. Let's go through that.
Sure. So starting with the basics, we've got standard copy paper, usually around 70-80 GSM. As we've talked about, it doesn't really stop bleed through that well. It's okay for general writing with a ballpoint pen since that ink's not as runny.
Makes sense. So what's next?
Then you've got premium planner paper, which is usually 90 to 120 GSM. Way better at resisting bleed through. Good choice if you use gel pens, fountain pens, or even just for regular journaling where you might use different pens.
So a good all-rounder.
Pretty much, yeah. Then there's coated notebook paper, also usually in that 100-120 GSM range. This one's got really high bleed resistance,
Hmm.
especially good for things like calligraphy or taking detailed notes where you need that precise ink control.
So for the detail-oriented folks.
Exactly. And finally, we've got watercolor paper, the heavyweight champion. It's much thicker, 200-300 GSM. As you can guess from the name, it's made to handle wet mediums like ink washes, so no surprise that it pretty much eliminates any bleed-through.
The ultimate defense against bleed-through. And I'm guessing Lion Paper has some recommendations based on how you actually use your planner.
They do. For everyday planners, they suggest going for that 9100 GSM smooth paper. Good balance of writing, feel, and bleed resistance.
Just practical.
It is. And for those creative journalers out there, they recommend bumping it up a bit to that 110 GSM coated paper. Just that extra bit of protection against ink going where it shouldn't, especially if you're using a mix of pens or maybe even some light watercolors.
And what about our fountain pen friends?
For the fountain pen lovers, Lion Paper suggests a 120 GSM hybrid paper. It's designed specifically for those wetter inks, so you don't have to worry as much about feathering or pooling. Makes writing a lot smoother.
It's all about finding the right match for your needs and your favorite pens.
Exactly. And if you're the one making or customizing planners, this just shows how important that paper choice really is. It's not just a small detail. It can make or break the whole experience for your customers.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, wouldn't you say? We've learned that ink bleeding in planners isn't just something you have to live with. There are solutions out there.
Absolutely. And it all starts with understanding why it happens. The type of paper, how absorbent it is, the weight, all that plays a role. And then knowing what to look for in terms of those specifications and coatings, that's how you find the right paper for you.
Exactly. So if you've been battling those messy bleeds, take heart, there's hope. You don't have to put up with it. And Lion Paper, with their focus on bleed-resistant paper, those special coatings, and all those customized options, they're really trying to help people overcome this problem.
Yeah, they are. And for businesses that use planners, it's a reminder that good quality paper is worth the investment. It keeps your customers happy, gets you better reviews, and ultimately helps your brand succeed.
It's so true, and it really gets you thinking all these everyday things we use, like a simple sheet of paper, there's a whole world of science and engineering behind them. We don't always think about it, but those tiny details make a huge difference in how things work. And it makes you wonder, what other everyday objects around us are full of hidden tech and science that we never even notice?
That's a good question.
Yeah, definitely something to ponder. All right, everyone, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of ink and paper. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.
Bye for now.